Hello YouTube, this is Adam Noyce of AM Productions, and welcome to this episode of Concerning The Godzilla Saga. Now today we're going to be talking about the military characters of the very first book of the Godzilla Saga, which is Godzilla King Kong, The Battle for Earth. Kind of a ridiculous title in hindsight, but I decided to keep it for the sake of childhood. But these are just the military characters, and it's kind of weird how the character system is going to be broken up. You basically got the characters from Godzilla and King Kong, and then you have the characters from the next three books. That's how everything works. Again, I kind of explained this before, but I'll explain it in brief here. Godzilla and King Kong serves mainly as a prequel to the trilogy that follows. You know, it's the first book of the Godzilla Saga, which is four novels in total, but it's basically the prequel. It sets up the stage for what happens in the trilogy that follows. And so we're going to talk about the military characters today, or at least the most important of the military characters. Some characters pop up that are like secondary characters in this book, but a lot of them we'll actually get into a little later. But here are the main characters. First, let's just dive right on into this. First, we have General Kenneth Costa. Now, General Kenneth Costa, I describe him as having unbelievably brown hair and really dark brown eyes. And I actually got the inspiration from Tom Cruise in Valkyrie, without the eye patch, or the missing fingers. He basically looks like Tom Cruise from Valkyrie, except a little older. Now, Costa was born in Illinois. He grew up on a milk farm. He was a farm boy. That's where he worked his entire childhood with his father, as he worked on a small farm in Illinois. In school, he was actually very well liked by his teachers. And one of the reasons why he wasn't like the best of student, but one of the reasons why he was liked by his teacher was because he always tried hard to understand what was going on. He always put a little effort into something, into actually trying to understand what was going on in his class and what was going on around the world. So teachers admired that. They liked that a lot. And what happened was, in high school, he became friends with an enlister. Again, this was at the time where the U.S. military was at its height. If you really want to know this alternate timeline's United States military history, go watch the previous video of the Second Iraq-Iran War. But he became friends with this enlister, and he decided it was best to join up. So he did. He joined up at the age of 18. Right as soon as he graduated high school, he joined the military. And again, the military was at its height at this time. They were taking in anybody. It was very easy to get in. And at the same time, they were really gearing up for a war. So they were looking for anyone they could really get their hands on, especially somebody who was as well educated or as ambitious as Costa, because again, Costa had all these referrals and everything like that because he was such a good student in school. Now, Costa had always dreamed about having some sort of a military career. He thought it was a good way to explore parts of the world, because again, he was part of this sort of small, rural Illinois town. Again, he worked on a milk farm. He always had these dreams of being able to explore the world. And quite frankly, he was getting bored and tired of Illinois. He was tired of seeing the same people over and over and again. He wanted to explore the world and see what it was really like. Now, he wasn't like an idealist or anything. He wasn't like, oh, the world is this beautiful place. No, he just genuinely wanted to kind of explore the world for all of its goods and all of its bads. That was just who Costa was. Costa was just a naturally curious kind of person, and the military, to him, gave him the best option possible to actually fulfill that sort of dream of wanting to kind of explore the world. So what he did was, he was accepted and attended the Virginia Military Institute, which of course he pulled a few favors to get there, because I mean, he wasn't the best at school, but he wasn't really good enough to get grades to go to the VMI. So, but he pulled a couple strings with this enlister, and of course they really liked him because he showed a lot of potential. It wasn't that he was good, it was that he showed a lot of potential to be good. And so the military kind of caught on that, and they accepted him into he was accepted into VMI. Again, it's a lot easier to get into these institutes in this timeline than it is in our timeline. And of course, he actually had massive support from his father, and his father had served 20 years. When Costa was a little boy, his father was in the army and stationed, I believe, somewhere in Germany, if I remember correctly. But he was stationed somewhere in Germany, but he never fought in a war. He was stationed over in Germany basically to keep the Soviets at bay. And so his father was in full support of Costa when he got accepted to VMI, and was unbelievably proud of his son. Costa, however, was a quick learner when it came to VMI. He quickly learned that he had a knack for tactics, basically being able to see a map, know what's going on, see where his troops are laid, and see where the situation is going, and know what to do from there. He was very good at being able to think on his feet, and he was very good at being able to mobilize. He, specifically though, he specialized in defensive strategies. So basically, if the enemy was attacking, Costa was the man you wanted to go to if Costa was the man you wanted to go to, because he was really good at being able to lay a defensive posture against an oncoming enemy, even if he's outnumbered 10-1, which he would definitely prove that in the second Iraq-Iran war. And then, of course, he actually wound up graduating third in his class. He wasn't the best, but he was pretty damn close to it. He graduated third in his class, which of course he was very proud of. If anything, Costa is kind of a proud man of the fact that, he was this boy that did average in school, and then all of a sudden he went on to do something great. Now, when the second Iraq-Iran war actually finally broke out, the army was basically in desperate need of officers on the field. It was sort of the same situation that happened during the American Civil War. There's a character, there's a person named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and he was a teacher at a university, and he knew tactics. He didn't really study military stuff, but he knew of tactics. And because the war had broken out with the Confederate States of America, the Union was in desperate needs of officers, and Chamberlain was chosen to be one of them, and Chamberlain agreed, and Chamberlain became a colonel. Same thing kind of happened to Costa here. Costa immediately got promoted basically to a lieutenant colonel because he did so well in VMI, and also because they really needed officers on the field, and again, Costa had proven himself that he's pretty competent with tactics, still specifically defensive tactics. So he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and Costa loved the rank. He absolutely loved that rank, and the reason why he loved it was because he was always moving. He wasn't stuck behind a desk. He was always on the field. He was always moving. He was always seeing these new sights, these new places, especially early on in the war, because again, like the first few years of the war went pretty smoothly for the United States. So he's seeing all these sights and everything. He was doing what he always wanted to do, which was actually explore the world. And for a while there, Costa actually considered this to be the best time of his life. Those first few years of the war, he thought that this was the best time of his life. However, things took very quickly a dramatic 180-degree turn. Costa in total fought a total of 12 successful campaigns. These are successful campaigns, not ones that have failed. Not many have failed, by the way. But he fought in 12 of these. And he led each one of these campaigns personally. And again, this is at the height of the second Iraq-Iran war. And because he personally was always on the field during these battles, and he was always leading the charge, basically, he became adored by those working under him. Though he wasn't necessarily in the mind of the actual soldiers themselves, like the privates and corporals and everything actually on the field, it was the ranking officers above them that really just adored Costa, and they'd go to Costa for anything. They would ask his opinion and everything because they trusted Costa. Because again, Costa, 12 successful campaigns, that's a lot. Costa had proved himself unbelievably worthy on the battlefield and unbelievably trustworthy. Costa was a man who, there was one offensive where some soldiers were kind of like left alone. This battalion of soldiers were left alone. They're under heavy gunfire. And so what happened was High Command got word of this, and everyone was all bogged down. Supplies were cut short and everything like that. And what Costa did was he said, I can get them out of there in 2 days, which everyone thought was impossible. But no, Costa personally led the charge, and he managed to gather up enough troops and supplies. And basically what he did was he did a shock and awe campaign. He was outnumbered 10-1, remember this. But he did a shock and awe campaign and managed to get those soldiers out of there. Not only airlift them, but actually get ground forces in there to cover the actual retreat. And then another example was he managed to save about 90% of his battalion, his own personal battalion, when there was a huge counterattack happened. And by the way, it was this counterattack that kind of began the end of the Second Iraq-Iran War for the United States Army. And he was outnumbered 12 to 1. Outnumbered 12 to 1. But here's the difference. When I say that he was outnumbered 12 to 1, a lot of these soldiers that they were fighting, that the U.S. Army was fighting, were not actually trained soldiers. They were guerrillas. They were civilians. They were women and children, some of them. It was a bloody mess, to say the least. It was a bloody mess. And basically what happened here, he was outnumbered 12 to 1. Costa proved just how good he was at defensive tactics here, because Costa basically set up a huge line of defense using a mixture of trench warfare and using the building structures in the city to his advantage. And he basically held until reinforcements arrived, which was 3 days. He held 3 days, no supplies, no food, no nothing, until reinforcements arrived, which were mainly tanks and ammunition, to basically bog down the actual attack. Then came the Baghdad offensive. The Baghdad offensive was the thing that truly turned the tide of the war, not just in terms of things going badly for the United States Army, but also it really showcased, in part with help of another character we'll get into in a different video, but it really showcased just how bad this war was starting to go, and that there was no real reason why we were there anymore. And that was when public opinion started to turn drastically. But the Baghdad offensive was basically this universe's Tet offensive from the Vietnam War. A massive counterattack by Iraqi and Iranian forces happened on two fronts. You had basically the northern front, then you had the eastern front, and they were both attacked heavily. This resulted in actually the loss of the city of Baghdad, which was kind of like the symbolic sort of center of the war, was Baghdad. Americans lost it, and at the same time they lost 5 oil refineries. Now when they lost these, again, remember that oil was so important at this time, again, because of those oil tycoons in the United States. Again, if you want more information on that, go on the Second Iraq-Iran War video. But losing those 5 refineries was unbelievably bad. It started driving oil prices right up and everything like that. There's a whole lot of things other than just, the monstrosities that were going on in the battle that started changing the tide of the war itself. And all of these oil refineries, by the way, were utterly destroyed. There was nothing left of them. They burned them to the ground, basically, and created a huge environmental mess, and it was nasty. But in total, 12,000 people were killed within 10 days. This is both sides. 12,000. This was the bloodiest day of the war, or the bloodiest few days of the war. In these 10 days, this battle was definitely one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest battle of the war. It was actually during this battle that Costa got promoted to actual colonel. Before he was a lieutenant colonel, now he got promoted to colonel. And it was also during this battle that Costa met a couple people that became very, very important in his life. He met both Colonel Montgomery, which we'll discuss a little later in this video, and Major McTavish, who we won't talk about here, but we might talk about in a different video. And these two became absolutely vast friends, kind of by default. They were under fire, under constant attack all the time, and they learned to rely on each other, and they became brothers in arms, and they became really close as a result of this. To this day, even in the events of the novel Godzilla King Kong, they are very, very close friends. And basically they worked together as a pretty solid team, especially when they were left alone for so long. Costa was the person in charge of the defensive tactics. Montgomery was in charge of logistics, actually getting people and moving people here while reinforcing this area, while maintaining this area. That was what Monty was doing, while McTavish was the enforcer. McTavish was the person actually on the front lines, actually rallying the soldiers, keeping them there, making sure medical supplies came in, actually distributing those medical supplies, distributing ammo. That was who McTavish was. And they worked unbelievably well together as a team. So as a result, as the years kept going on, everyone began to know that the war was absolutely unobtainable. And Costa is placed under command. Costa is placed under command of General John Bell Hood. And basically, he begins to organize a retreat strategy, because it was decided by Washington after some sort of overhaul. It was voted that the war was, we were supposed to leave the Middle East. Everything was leaving. So Costa was actually put in charge of actually starting to organize this kind of retreat. And this was a massive retreat, even larger, even much larger than the scale of the retreat at Dunkirk in World War II. Costa uses both McTavish and Monty extensively here. He uses that friendship, and he uses them to the best of his ability, because again, they made such a great team. Monty was in charge of the actual evacuations, while McTavish was in charge of the actual front lines, guarding the retreat to make sure that they were there, which, to be honest, that actually got McTavish into trouble a little bit later. But we'll get into that in a different video, in a different time. But together they saved thousands of lives. And despite there were some long-term ramifications for something that McTavish did, but we'll get into that in a different video. Then came the last days of the war, and Costa did something that would kind of shape the rest of his career. Costa refused to leave. Costa actually, well, what happened was he had a chance to leave. There were still helicopters transporting people out of there, transporting them out to sea and everything like that. This is in Kuwait. Costa refused his chance to leave. He actually gave it up to a woman and child in Kuwait. This is in Kuwait. He gave up his seat to a mother and her baby child. And as a result, he stayed with his soldiers during the siege of Al-Jahara. Now, Al-Jahara was kind of, to the army and to basically the armed forces of the United States, it was a rallying cry. It's one of those events that will go down in history as one of the greatest moments ever. But to the public, it was just a slaughterhouse, and a lot of people were killed. You know, it just shows the great divide between the United States military and just the general public itself. How they just really just split apart, which has never really happened, except in Vietnam War, but it was even worse here. And basically, it was during this siege. I mean, it was completely surrounded. That's why the people were being airlifted out of there. It was during this siege that basically the city, Al-Jahara, was just turned to dust. They were under constant artillery fire and constant skirmishes. And they were literally outnumbered 20-1. And they had no idea who the enemy was. There were women, there were children blowing themselves up in the street. And again, this is sort of the plight of an Islamic war like this. They had no idea who the enemy was, so they were literally... Costa gave the order to just shoot on sight. Just shoot on sight. Because to him, it was black and white. And quite frankly, I agree with his decision. It was black and white. You kill or you be killed. It's them or us. And because they were completely surrounded, McTavish, Monty, and Costa and the soldiers there, they were stranded in this city, completely surrounded, for 14 days. No food, no water, no medical supplies, nothing. They were stranded there for 14 days. They were down to hand-to-hand combat. It was that bad. They had bayonets fixed. It was that bad. In fact, if they had gone on to another 15 days, they would have been overrun. Costa knew that straight up. They would have been overrun. Together, Costa, Monty, and McTavish held the line until they were carried out by air. Reinforcements were able to arrive. Now, there are 355 men that were stranded behind during the siege of Al-Jahara, Costa, Monty, and McTavish being 3 of them. And out of that 355, they had lost 245. So quite frankly, though, the fact that as many of them made it out as that is a testament to Costa himself, because Costa was the man in charge during this battle. Costa would always feel guilty for not being able to save more of those men. Always, and it haunts him to this day. In fact, he continually feels depressed because of it. He feels like he could have done more. And without really constantly knowing it, this battle really changed him. I mean, he'd seen a lot, and seen a lot of the monstrosities going on over there, and the atrocities going on over there, but this battle really changed him. He became a much quieter person. He became far more reserved and more inwards. Back at home, Costa managed to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery during this battle. However, even though he won, you know, like, if you get a Medal of Honor, it's supposed to be like this huge moment and a grand moment and everything like that. But as soon as he got that medal, he was just utterly berated by the general public. Berated, just torn to shreds. Protests out in front of his houses. Death threats being sent to his house constantly being spray painted, child killer and everything like that. Again, mainly from the youth of this country. And quite frankly, Costa thought he didn't deserve either of these. He didn't felt like he deserved the Medal of Honor, and he didn't felt like he deserved being attacked at the same time. And again, this was actually, him receiving the Medal of Honor and everything was actually before the absolute huge overhaul of the United States government, which was 90% of elected officials were voted out. That's a lot. It was during this time period that Costa met a woman. Costa met this woman and he fell in love with her. For the first time in his life, he felt like he actually genuinely fell in love with somebody. And he was a very scared and timid person because of this. And yet, at the same time, so was she. You'd see, what it had eventually made them come together was that she had served in Kuwait, in a Kuwait hospital during the war. And she managed to escape before the siege of Al-Jahara. Both of them fell madly in love with each other. To be frankly, they were kind of perfect for each other. They were both broken in a couple ways, but yet they were good for each other. That's all I will say about that. But yeah, during this time period, public outcry of Costa only got worse and worse and worse. And their house was constantly vandalized. The press were watching their every move. You know, it was kind of like how they were treating celebrities now. And dozens of teenagers would stand in front of their house day and night, constantly mocking them and disrespecting them. Constantly. It was just terrible. And this is too much for the girl. This is too much for the person that Costa had fallen in love with. She just couldn't handle it. She could not handle it. And what happened was she left him in the middle of the night. Literally in the middle of the night, only leaving a note explaining everything, how she couldn't handle this and she didn't know what was coming and how sorry she was. But she snuck out in the middle of the night and left him a note. This left Costa a shell of what he was. Because again, he was already having problems seeing the atrocities that he did in the war, but now all of a sudden the person he falls in love with has left him because of the populace outcry of what he did. But it was because of this he decided to return to his militarist lifestyle as basically a way to cope. He never searched for her out of respect. He never went out and looked for her or anything like that. He said she left. I'm going to respect her decision, and I'm going to do my own thing to try to cope. And that's what he did. So he returned to the militarist lifestyle. And he remained under General Hood's command. And he remains there right to this day, right up until the strike of the Meteor Flora, which is the beginning of the book Godzilla. And the next character we have is Colonel Benjamin Hagans. Colonel Benjamin Hagans is basically, he's got dark blonde hair, extremely pale skin, and he has these unnaturally light blue eyes. These really, really light blue eyes. He was born, unlike Costa, into a life of luxury. The Hagans family owned the 3rd largest oil company in the United States and the 20th largest oil company in the entire world, and there are a lot of oil companies. And the Hagans business actually owned 30% of the refineries in the Middle East and 10% of the United States. So they were loaded. And they became a powerful family as a result. They kind of reminded me of the Kennedys, how powerful the Kennedys became. In school, Hagans was basically a jock. He was a sports jock. He played soccer and basketball. Those are the two sports he played the most. And quite frankly, he was naturally a ladies' man. Now, it was during the Second Iraq-Iran War that Benjamin Hagans watched his entire family name basically get utterly destroyed. Especially because the actual loss of the Second Iraq-Iran War actually killed the company. The actual loss killed the company because they lost all those refineries. It killed the company, and the family lost its luxury, basically. They filed for bankrupt just 3 years after the war because they just could not handle the lack of revenue. They couldn't adapt. The Hagans family had been so used to being this big tycoon that suddenly, when they didn't have this source of income, they didn't know how to cope. So just 3 years after the Second Iran War ended, they filed for bankruptcy. So Hagans went from having basically everything at his fingertips to having almost nothing other than just the mockery of his name. He lost the mansion he lived in, he lost all the money, and he lost all of his assets. As a result, he left sports, his love for sports, and basically focused on schooling itself. He became the valedictorian of his class, and the thing with him, though, was that he was hated by everyone. He had no friends at all. He was hated by everyone, especially because of the Second Iraq-Iran War. Though he was popular for a while, when the Second Iraq-Iran War ended, he became hated by everyone. No sympathy at all. He became hated by everyone because of his family's association with that war. Because they were the oil people. They were the reasons why some of them had brothers or parents that had died and been killed. The Hagans family was a part of the result. Or the Hagans family was part of the reason why they were now gone. Now, Hagans was too young during the war to actually be able to enlist or be drafted, but he desperately wanted to fight in the war. Hagans desperately wanted to fight in the war. You see, he wanted to go over there and fight because he thought it would return some honor to the Hagans name, which is a very idealistic kind of thing. In fact, that's what Hagans is. Hagans is kind of a romantic during this time of his life. But he thought it would return honor to the Hagans name if he did something really, really brave. Like if he did a Teddy Roosevelt and led a charge of the Rough Riders, it would return some honor to the Hagans family instead of the mockery that it is now. And because he had sort of a romantic ideal of the military. And so then what happened was, towards the end of the war, he heard about the siege of Al-Jahara. He heard about the bravery of Colonel Costa and McTavish and Monty. And he began to worship specifically Costa as basically like a god in his eyes. Costa could not do wrong in Hagans' eyes. So what happened was, again, he was valedictorian. After a couple years basically fending on his own, working jobs and everything like that, he applied to several military academies to study to be an officer. When he finally got accepted to one of these, he was a very popular kid. He was a very popular kid. He used his charm and good looks, basically, to get around. And it was during this time period he became quite a man whore. He took great pride in the fact that he slept around a lot, and never with the same woman more than twice. That was basically him in a nutshell during this time period. But he was also known for his ambitious attitude. He had a very ambitious and slightly cocky attitude towards everything that he did. He always was the first to volunteer for something, and sometimes that got him into trouble, but he always took it in stride because he was ambitious. He wanted to grow, he wanted to be better, he wanted to do this, he wanted to prove himself. Again, to kind of hopefully return honor to the Hagans name. And he always wanted to do things big. In fact, one of the reasons why a lot of people started to not like him later on in his career was because he always liked to show off how much power he actually had. He always liked to make things bigger than what they actually were. Like, if you needed 10 men to take care of this, he'd give you 50. That was the kind of man that Hagans was. It was during this time at the military academy when this, the United States overall happened and the United States military was budget was cut in half. He saw funding for these schools cut in half. Many students were forced to go home because, they weren't good enough or anything like that. And Hagans was never considered to be cut. Hagans was always at the top of the list of students who were meant to stay. And he was prized by high command because, again, like Costa at the very beginning of his career, Hagans was very much so, he had a lot of potential. He had a lot of potential to do good things. But even part of that, he was smart, he was handsome, and he was very charismatic, which was very important, specifically when the military had such a bad rep in the United States. They needed somebody who was smart, handsome, and charismatic. And he was exactly what the Army needed to help regain faith from the public eye. which is actually part of the reason why he managed to remain and didn't get cut in these military academies. He graduated first in his class, and he was ecstatic when Colonel Costa, now promoted to general, actually approached him to work with him on the East Coast under his command. Hagans felt that this to be the most important day of his life, when his hero basically acknowledged his existence and said, "Would you come work for me?" You know, this is anyone's dream. He still wants to make a larger name for himself, despite the fact that he's got a pretty damn good job. He wants to bring glory back to the Hagans name. That's always been one of his missions. That's always been one of the driving forces of everything that he does, and why he wants command so bad. So he desperately wants his own command, and thinks he is ready to take charge despite his little experience. He feels that he's ready to take charge of something. He doesn't care what it is. He wants to be able to prove himself. And he basically wants to overcome all these problems, and again, to really bring back the glory of the Hagans name. Currently, he works with Colonel Montgomery and Colonel Shinzu. Again, these characters we'll cover in a little bit. Hagans is often the most outspoken of the three. He has a closer relationship with Shinzu, both being, mainly because both were unable to serve during the actual war. They have a relationship there. They wanted to join, they wanted to fight, but they couldn't. Monty, on the other hand, does not like Hagans at all. He finds him arrogant and too cocky, which often gets Hagans into trouble. Now on to Colonel Dominique Shinzu. Colonel Shinzu was born in Boston. He had a Japanese immigrant mother who, immigrated over to the United States, and he had a father who was in the Navy. His father fought during the Second Iraq-Iran War and saw a lot of carnage and a lot of the atrocities that went on over there, and he killed a lot of people. Instead of coming home a hero, like all soldiers should, be it in this timeline or be it in our actual timeline, he came home to protesters and death threats. He came home. Shinzu's father became a very changed man who clearly suffered from a form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, though the man never sought treatment and never really admitted it. Shinzu's father would often beat him and his mother. He would have violent outbursts, and he would often drink or cry himself to sleep on the living room couch. Now this changed Shinzu. Shinzu himself, once a happy-go-lucky boy who used to play ball with his friends and used to be very vocal in school, became a very reclusive and quiet man. He focused on his schooling day and night, and he became number 2 in his class when he graduated. He applied and was accepted to the shrinking military academies because of his good grades and because of his goodwill, and also it didn't hurt that his father was also in the military. Secretly, he wanted to know what happened to his father. That was the main reason why he wanted to join the army, or some sort of branch in the military. He saw an opportunity he just happened to see an opportunity with the army, and he joined the army. But he wanted to know just what the hell happened to his dad. He wanted to know why his father acted the way he did. Shinzu became known for his brash attitude and brutal honesty, which to me are two great qualities. He often would push his own emotions aside. He'd be brutally honest with you, but he would often be kind of like a robot when saying it, and actually that kind of perpetuated it further. Him pushing his emotions kind of aside. And it made many people think that he's kind of a jerk, when really he's not. He's not really a jerk. He just likes to push his emotions aside because that's his way of coping with some of his problems. But he always gets his work done, and he does it exceptionally well. He was really good at mathematics and logistics. They were always his two strengths, even in school. He was very good at logistics and mathematics. And he was really sought after for consolidation with the shrinking size of the United States Army. They needed people to help with consolidating the United States Army, because now they didn't have anywhere near like these sub-branches and everything like that. No, now they needed to consolidate, and of course, Shinzu being good at mathematics and logistics, he was kind of one of the guys that they would naturally go towards. And because of this, they caught the attention of General Hood and General Costa. He started to work in Manhattan as a logistics officer, again, something that Shinzu was good at. It was during this time period that he lost almost all contact with his parents. And he actually is angered that they never tried to get in contact with him whatsoever and see how good he was. They didn't even show up to his graduation. He feels, quite frankly, abandoned. He hopes his work will continue to stunt his emotions long enough to figure things out on his own. Now we go to Colonel James Monty Montgomery. Monty was born in rural Nevada town. His family moved around the country a lot. They never stayed in one spot for very long. And so basically, when he was a child, he never had the chance to make friends in school. He was considered by many as a result to be a loner, when actually he really wanted friends and everything, but he didn't want to get attached to someone at the same time to only then have to leave and feel abandoned. Kind of the hedgehog's dilemma, sort of a more mutated version of the hedgehog's dilemma in a few ways. He had a hard time in school. He did have, because he was moving around so much. He could never form a relationship with his teachers or anything, and he had a hard time in school. He barely kept his 2.5 GPA, which is still good, don't get me wrong, but it's not the best. And he considered school, he started eventually, specifically in high school, he started considering school an absolute waste of time. He always wanted to work and make a living more than actually reading books and doing math. That was Monty in a nutshell. And he often got in trouble in school because of the fact that he didn't have any relationships with anybody. He was very rebellious. He was very much questioning everything that was going on in his school because he had no connections. He would question everything, which got him into trouble quite a bit. So what happened was, because of his GPA and everything like that, and it became increasingly harder and increasingly more competitive to get into a higher educational school, he never got accepted to any of the colleges or universities that he applied to. And so basically, Monty joined the United States Army as a last-ditch effort, and when he joined the United States Army, it was still at its height. This, again, being before the Second Iraq-Iran War broke out. He basically considered this his best chance to make either a name for himself or to make his family proud. He felt like it was the best chance that he had just to prove himself, to prove his worth, essentially. And he quickly rose through the ranks. He was extremely good at logistics and being able to think on his feet. That was one of his great qualities, Monty's great qualities. And he was granted the rank of Sergeant Major pretty quickly. And then when he was given that rank, he was actually then offered a full expense-paid commission to a military academy of his choice. And Monty, being the very smart man and kind of an opportunist, said, I fully accept it. He accepted it without hesitation. Even at the military academy, he was still considered by many to be a loner. Again, that whole thing of him moving around a lot as a child never really left him. But he was often put into commanding positions. And he did not relationships to compromise his actions, which actually made him a very good commander. It really genuinely did. He didn't want relationships to jeopardize decision-making. So again, he still kind of used that kind of... This is one of the reasons why I like Monty so much. He used one of those flaws of his and turned it into an advantage. One of my favorite things with any character ever, or any person ever, is when they have flaws, they know they have their flaws, but they try to turn it into an advantage, even if they fail. I always like that in a person. I like that in a character. And even though he was still kind of a loner, it did not stop him from being liked by those who served under him. Because he was a man who proved that when he had an objective, he would get things done, and he'd get them done as quickly as possible. Many even looked at him like a teacher or someone to look up to. Remember at this time, he was also slightly older than normal other cadets as well. So that also helped. He graduated from the academy 5th in his class, and immediately was promoted to lieutenant colonel at the outbreak of the war. The Second Iraq-Iran War. And he was basically one of the first people to actually be sent overseas as a result of this war. He volunteered. In the Middle East, Monty met Costa and McTavish. We already kind of covered this when we're talking about Costa. And they all became vast friends. And Monty considered them to be the first true friends he ever had. Being in combat together made them brothers, blood brothers, made them so close. And they all highly respected them. And he highly respects them. He vowed, basically, to never go against them or to hurt any of them. That he would always stand by their side. And again, because they were really his first true friends, he's unbelievably loyal to them both. Unbelievably loyal to them both. And this bond was sealed during the siege of Al-Jahara, where they had fought literally back to back. After he returned from Kuwait, he was both hailed for his bravery by fellow soldiers, but yet at the same time hated by the general populace. He was offered the rank of brigadier general pretty quickly as the United States Army was starting to shrink, and he refused it. Monty refused it and was content in the situation where he was. You see, it was after the Baghdad offensive, that great giant counterattack that I just kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, that Monty was placed in charge because his CO was killed. His CO was killed, and Monty was placed actually in charge. And Monty, from that point forward, felt like he did a better job at just the logistics part of things than the actual carrying things out part of things. Again, that was something more McTavish was good at. The war changed him, just like the war changed everybody who was involved with it, and even those who weren't involved with it. He tried to become more personal with his men as a result. For once, Monty feels kind of stationary. He's not moving around a lot. He's stationed in Manhattan, which is where a huge chunk of Godzilla King Kong takes place. And he's always kept in contact with General Costa. They've always kept in contact, and they've still remained to be good friends. However, he has lost sight of McTavish, which he regrets immensely after all they had been through together. And specifically all that McTavish has gone through, but that's for another video. So those were the main military characters of the first novel of the Godzilla Saga. I hope you enjoyed and I didn't bore you too much. This video was much longer than I anticipated it to be. Go on Facebook, like AN Productions for all up-to-date information about what we are doing. Join Geeks for Geeks if you want to promote yourself, promote stuff that you do, or promote things that you like. It's a Facebook group. Like the Godzilla Saga for all up-to-date information on the status of the 4 novels and art that is promoted of the novels. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, leave a comment saying how stupid I am, and in the end, this is Adam Royce of AN Productions saying, sayonara.